Welcome back to our Epiphany 2024 four-part series on the intimacy of God with Dr. Euan Grant. We've heard already two of our talks. The first one on the life of St. Thomas, the second one on creation in St. Thomas, and now the third one on the beatific vision and Thomas's understanding thereof. I look forward to that as much as I do to the beatific vision. Euan.
Well, thank you for that. I must say, probably notably lopsided introduction. I mean, I'm not sure that's the wisest thing to think, and I'm not sure St. Thomas would be glad to hear it, but I am, I suppose. So there we are. So yes, last time we talked about God and creation, and I tried to give you a sense of why it is that for Thomas, what I'd like to think of as God's highness, God's loftiness, God's exaltation, the way in which God is unlike everything else because God has the fullness of reality, of being, of actuality, is the way in which God also can be extremely intimate and close to us because there is no medium, no contrast, no competition between God and us. In fact, we all immediately come from God, and God in himself is, I promised I wouldn't use this phrase, but is always already as close to us as he wishes to be. This time, I want to talk about the way in which, nevertheless, though God is already there, God has already reached out to us, there is a process in Thomas thinking, there is a journey for us to go on to return to or to achieve, not necessarily in the sense of to earn, but nevertheless to achieve a fuller closeness or intimacy with God. And I'd like to start with another story about St. Thomas. We talked about this briefly, or I mentioned that I would come to this in our very first conversation at the end of the first lecture. This is the little story of Thomas's family who didn't want him famously to become a Dominican. So he's declared his intention. I think he's probably joined the order. He may be going off to Cologne, perhaps, to work with that other great medieval theologian, Albert the Great. But his mother sends his brothers to kidnap him, to take him to one of the family castles. Right? So they snatch him on the road. They take him off the family castle. They say, we're going to hold you here until you agree to become a Benedictine and an abbot and to do the right thing by the family. And when it's not working, they decide, well, okay, this sort of moral pressure isn't working. Maybe some immoral pressure will work instead. So they hire a prostitute to tempt him from the path of chastity. I don't know what it says about Monte Cassino at the time, that this was going to prevent him from becoming a Dominican, but not prevent him from becoming a Benedictine. But nevertheless, this is the story. They hire the prostitute. The poor girl goes in to tempt St. Thomas. He's spent his time, I think, tutoring his younger sisters in Latin or something like that around the same time. Anyway, but she goes in to tempt him, and he goes over to the fireplace, draws a burning log from it, chases her out, waving it in the air, draws a cross on the wall with the charred end, and then an angel comes to comfort him and girdle him with a girdle of chastity, promising him that he will never succumb to this particular sin. There's another story, I'm not sure if it's the same angel, in which an angel comforts St. Thomas with the news that he will never become a bishop. I don't know if any bishops will be watching, and they can think about whether that would be comforting news or not. There are some great paintings of this. In one, you can really see in the sort of swoon what an effort it's taken St. Thomas to resist this temptation on his chastity. He's really sort of lapsing into the angel's arms. But anyway, that's the story. So it's part of it is definitely true. You know, that the kidnapping, that's definitely true. And it's a good illustration, I think, of a certain medieval idea of virtue. Clearly, Thomas is a virtuous person. He's resisting this temptation. He's formed in his character, and he is going to achieve this sort of height of virtue in being girded by the angel. So virtue comes to him also as, in this case, a special divine gift. It's a story about virtue, and it's a story also, therefore, about ethics. And the Summa Theologiae, I mentioned it's in 3 parts. The second part is, in a broad sense, about ethics. That's both the first part of the second part, which is about the shape of the ethical life, perhaps, the structures of the ethical life. And then the second part of the second part is about particular ethical questions, particular virtues, particular vices, particular ways and states of living one's life. But all of that ethical material is framed by the idea of God as the end, that is to say, the destination, the goal, and God as the way, in an important sense, God as the way in which we live our ethical life. And that's the subject that I want to focus on here. So the ethical in Thomas is not about assuring my own righteousness. It's not about earning my salvation as a property for me in some sense, which I think is what some of us perhaps might be inclined to think of as works righteousness. Instead, it's about our journey closer to God, which God, who is already close to us both in his being and in his intention, is drawing us on towards, right? So, the closeness is what God is drawing us on towards. So I'll take this in Thomas's order and start with the end to which we are directed, because for Thomas, the whole world is full of purpose. I talked about the act and potency arguments for the existence of God. The fifth argument, the fifth way, is to do with purposiveness. Teleology, as we call it in technical language, the study of teloi, which are ends or purposes. And the good, then, the subject matter of ethics, the subject matter of ethical questions, is about bringing about the true purposes of things. And while there are many different purposes in the world, there is only one final purpose, one end or goal of everything, and of course that is God. So God is not just the beginning, God is also the end of all things. And that's true for all creatures, for Thomas, but it's true in a special way for human beings and for angels, of course, for spiritual creatures. Now, spiritual doesn't mean disembodied. Human beings are embodied spiritual creatures, where our angels are bodiless spiritual creatures for Thomas. Because the purpose, the end, or the goal of spiritual creatures is to see God. It's to have what Thomas, in the general medieval tradition and then the Latin tradition following him, calls the beatific vision, where beatific just means blessed, the vision that makes us blessed. Now, that might seem, I think, like a bit of a flat idea. Okay, so the beatific vision is the vision of God, right? Seeing God, seeing God's essence. But is that like staring at God up on a cinema screen? So we've got God out there, and here we are, looking at God, and we're thinking, wow, this is so great. Look at all this God all around us. It's amazing. You know, you never get to the end of it. We're just gazing out at it, sort of gawping, open-mouthed. That might be kind of appreciative, but is that very loving? Is that very active? It kind of seems sort of passive and dull. Thomas obviously thinks that this is not just not loving, but the end and final goal of all love. And he also thinks it's the highest form of human activity. So rather than being a sort of way in which we're standing outside God, kind of looking around at it like, I don't know, particularly sort of dense tourist in a great cathedral, instead, seeing God is the ultimate degree and act of intimacy. So how does that work? Here, I'm afraid, we get to our next piece of Aristotelian jargon, though this one perhaps is a little closer to things that we use, words as we use them nowadays. So I want to introduce two concepts to you: motion, okay, you've probably heard of that one before, and operation. So acts, in the sense of activities, things one does, are for Thomas always oriented towards a goal. But some activities have a goal that's outside the activity, And for some activities, the goal is inside the activity. So if I am, let's say, going over, there are some great, I love some sort of Muppet stuff is brilliant. So let's imagine I'm the Cookie Monster, right? And I want to move myself to get a cookie, okay? They're clearly, as I'm bobbing along the top of the surface that allows me to be puppeted around, that's a motion. I am moving towards an end which is extrinsic to the motion. Getting the cookie, so that I can then sort of consume it viciously, is a motion. The end or goal is outside the activity, the moving around. I suppose Kermit the Frog might have the beatific vision, but that's not that helpful. So let's leave aside the Muppet examples and say some activities, though, doing it is itself the point. Perhaps we could say that the sorts of things that illustrate this most in ordinary life are things like games or dances or maybe ceremonies. I'm just naming things I happen to like. Where being part of the activity is the point of the activity. There isn't some further thing that we're trying to gain. Now, of course, you can play sports or games in two different ways. You can play just to win, in which case everything you're doing in the game will just be a sort of motion, which will either succeed or fail. Or you can play for the game itself, in which case, whether you win or lose, you will have attained the end, and your play will be, in an Aristotelian sense, a sort of operation. Okay. It's not too helpful how these words have come through to us in English, but there we are. That's the distinction. Motion, moving towards something that's outside the motion itself. Operation, the end or purpose of the activity lies in the activity itself. Okay. One more piece of jargon or technicality. Thomas thinks that we have two spiritual powers, two capacities or abilities in our soul. And he calls them the intellect and the will. Again, not quite the same as modern terms. Though they are the power for knowing and the power for wanting or desiring. The thing is that knowing, for Thomas, is fundamentally a way that something which is out there comes to be, in a spiritual sense, inside you. Now, that doesn't, take this lectern again as an example. It's not particularly interesting, I don't think, if I have the lectern in my head because I know it, because I'm familiar with it. But maybe take it as an example with another person. There's a deep degree of intimacy that comes with the sort of familiarity that we use when you say you know someone else deeply. For Thomas, that really would be a sense in which they are inside you, and if it's a mutual thing, you are mutually inside one another. And so knowing, for Thomas, can be a sort of operation. It can have its own value within itself. To know someone else is, in itself, the valuable thing. You don't just get to know someone for the sake of something further. That would just be networking. Okay, but when you have a friendship or when you have love, then you have a knowing for its own sake. And that knowing is this sort of mutual inwardness, this intimacy. So desiring, and Thomas would use the word loving here, amare, is much less for him an operation. It's much more emotion. Okay, so we move towards things because we desire them. But the way we come to have them or possess them, but not necessarily with any implication that we have an ownership of them, is by knowledge. So for Thomas, knowing would in some ways be more the form of loving than loving, because loving is only the thing that moves us towards the end. Okay, don't take that too strongly. But you'll see where this is going when we get to God, right? Because we're moving towards something when we have a love for it in order to be united with it. Okay, so for Thomas, classical definition of love is a will for the good of the thing that's loved, but also for union with the thing that's loved. And for Thomas, this union happens by a sort of maximum mutual knowing. There's this mutual intimacy and transparency. And so the beatific vision then, when we get to God as the object of love, is not, in some sense, our staring at the object from a distance. It's not me looking at God as if I were to look, say, at this lectern and think, well, I quite like this Art Deco Gothic stuff, this is pretty great. Instead, vision of God is being united with God according to that power of intellect, according to that power whereby one can be mutually contained one within another. And that's an operation which is its own end. So it's not even a static thing. It's not just that we get there and then we stop. Instead, this knowing of God, this intimacy with God is a full exercise of our spiritual powers. It's the sort of maximum degree of being a spiritual being. Because to have God, to be united with God in this way, is to be far more fully exercised in one's capacities for intimacy than is possible with any other object. And that, according to Thomas, is the final and unsurpassable degree of intimacy which God wants us to have. But I mean, I admit I slightly did down loving, even in Thomas's terms, the way we get there, because that's deeply important too. Even if vision is where we end up, even if the operatio is where we are, finally things come to their full culmination, there's also an important sense in which the way there, the motion, is also an intimacy with God. So the basic principle of Thomas's ethics is that we get to be with God in this way by loving in the way that God loves. And that capacity to love in the way that God loves has to come from God as a gift of grace. Grace for Thomas is the gift which God gives us, which lifts us beyond the powers of our own nature to allow us to love in God's way rather than in our way. And we remember that God's way, of course, is completely free. It's completely giving because God has no need of the world to perfect himself. So the basic idea here is that there's a natural way of loving and acting, and that's good insofar as it goes. God looked at the world and saw that all things were very good. But the beatific vision, this degree of intimacy with God, goes beyond anything that we could reach naturally. And so while God has destined us for this, while God has in an important sense designed us for this intimacy, nevertheless, because it's an intimacy which is proper to God in a way that outstrips creaturehood itself in some ways, God gives us new ways of knowing and loving which are his own ways. So we love God in grace. We receive, says Thomas, the theological virtues, faith, hope, charity. And charity is the Christian love which loves God first and then loves everything else in light of God. And so it's the love that finally gets everything in the right place and gets everything in the right order, because while there's no competition between God and other things, putting God first shows everything else in the appropriate light. And so we have these theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, but in the beatific vision, faith and hope are transformed into sight. They are virtues of motion. We have faith in what we don't quite see, and we hope for what we have not yet attained. But God intends for us, for those to be turned into vision, for those to be fulfilled in the final intimacy of beatitude. But charity remains. Charity never goes away, because charity is loving like God loves, and that while on earth that moves us towards God, when we attain God by intellect, when we see God, when we are made intimate with God in this mutual knowledge, that overflows, Thomas says, into joy, and it overflows also from the soul and the spirit into the body in the resurrection. So God is the way, as well as the end. To be like God is the way to God. Charity, the virtue of divine love, makes us able to reach God by making us like God. And so we participate in God in a new way. We said in the second talk, that to be at all is to be immediately from God, is to be created, and is therefore already to be subject to the intimacy of God's closeness. But here, in charity, the gift of grace, there is not just a new being, but a new life, a new participation in God by life and love. So there's intimacy with God as a creature, and the infinite intimacy on God's side is mirrored in a growing and increasing intimacy on the creaturely side, which grace draws beyond its own creatureliness to a full imitation of divine love. And so for Thomas, grace is not just something which rescues us from sin. To be saved is not just to be rescued from sin. It's to be made like God, to be brought to be with God, to be divinized, to be glorified, and it's the way to God. But really God, of course, is the way to God, and that's God made man, the way, the truth, and the life. And that is what we'll talk about next time.
Euan, each time we start one of these conversations, this being the third one now, I go back to my own days studying philosophy. And one of the things that I thought about as you were speaking was the rivalry that we had back in those days between those who were more or less Augustinians and those who were more or less Thomists, or at least who claimed to be in different camps. And I thought of Augustine in his Confessions in the first chapter of the first book, writing about our desire for God. He writes, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. And I wonder if you could put together the desire for God, wrapped in, of course, with the teleological or philosophical idea of ends in terms of the beatific vision. Probably a big ask, but maybe you could take a stab at that.
That is a big ask. I've just read a book about this. There's a little bit of perhaps academic inside baseball is that you'll know that there's a big debate about this in particularly modern Catholic theology, about how to think about the desire for God. How to think about. So I mentioned that grace takes us beyond our nature. It takes us beyond what is simply human and brings us to love, particularly in a divine way. And the question, the Thomist question, this is not an Augustinian question, or the question for the Thomists is how to wrap in Augustine's insight, if we've got this nature and we need grace, which has to be an additional free gift, to get to this end, to get to this telos, this goal, and we desire the goal, on the one hand, we must desire the goal so that grace isn't this sort of strange additional extrinsic thing which changes what we are and makes us into something else. But on the other hand, if we've got the desire for it, can it really be a free gift? If we've only got this end in God, how is it a free gift for God to give us grace to reach it? Surely he sort of owes us in some sense, because he made us like this. The solution for that is long and difficult, and maybe we shouldn't attempt that here. But I think perhaps the interesting thing is it points to something different between Thomist and Augustinian ways of thinking about this, which is that I think with Thomas, you have to do a bit of work to get at what let's say, the existential implications are. I don't think with Thomas you can just read a page and say, okay, I see what that's like. And that's, I suppose, one of the things that I'm trying to perhaps to point out in all of these talks, actually, is that if we just say, okay, I've got the words of St. Thomas, I know what love is, I know what intellect is, I know what knowledge is. So I know that if Thomas says if knowledge is the final end and love is the way towards it, well, I can sort of work out what that's going to be like. And it doesn't sound that good to me at all, I think my reading of Augustine is that generally he is writing in a way that is quite experiential. It's generally Augustinian terms, and Augustine's desire, his restlessness, that's something that you can experience. With Thomas, I think working out what the experiences are which correlate with this structure, I think the structure is generally well-founded, but working out what the experiences are that would correlate with that structure is actually a more difficult question, which is why I wanted to frame these things in terms of intimacy with God, because it doesn't sound like intimacy at all. It's going to sound, if you don't think it sounds like intimacy when I'm explaining it, let me tell you, it's going to sound even less like that reading Thomas in any English translation you'd care to, let alone in Latin. So there's work to be done to see that there's more going on in what these things are like than is just what's there on the surface. And I think in many ways Thomas is giving an account of something that Augustine's more experiential account is also an account of, but in a very different way. Does that make sense?
It does, and I struggle a bit myself with reconciling Aristotle and Aquinas in terms of our own telos. So, from a very strictly pagan philosophical point of view, Aristotle tells us that everything has an end. Everything is moving towards something. It has a goal, if you will, a telos. And we have one too, to be with God. And obviously Aquinas talks a great deal about that. Some people would even say almost all of his theology is eschatological in that sense, because it's pointing towards this final end in God. And as that desire swells up in us, I guess sometimes I struggle with how much of that is natural desire. So it was something that would be present in the human soul, the unbaptized soul, if you will. And as you mentioned before, some people just speak about Thomas as baptizing Aristotle in some sense. And then how much of that would be dependent on grace, or at least attuned to grace, or dependent isn't the right word, but I don't know if you could take a stab at that one too.
No, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think the work that I've particularly done as an academic, a very lowly academic, is trying to give what is not simply a direct reading, but a reading of Aquinas where, in some sense, Christian history has mattered, actually, for how people think about that. There are lots of, if any academics are watching, there are plenty of complexities and caveats for that, so don't worry if you're a Thomist and you're thinking, what is this man saying? But I agree, and I think the way I would put this, or something that I find very interesting about that, is that it raises the question of the sort of introspective availability of grace. That is to say, can you look in yourself and see grace there? And I'm not saying that the answer to that is absolutely no, but I'm quite keen to suggest, at least, that the answer won't always be yes. And this is, so Thomas has this idea that grace is infused by God. It's sort of poured in. When we have these virtues, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are given as free gifts by God, rather than being acquired. So, Aristotle, you reach your end by having good habits, and you build up these habits by repetitive practice. They're like habits as we understand them now. That one, at least, the word means basically the same thing. That's a win. But with these habits, these virtues, which are good habits of grace, faith and hope and charity, Thomas thinks they sort of appear, God gives them instantaneously as these complete gifts. But I don't think that's necessarily means that we'll always see them appearing in us introspectively, complete and sort of radiant all the time. So I think that's an interesting one. And And how that relates to this question of whether then these desires are awakened by grace or not. I think we should be careful in both directions, careful about saying where God has and has not been gracious, though the sort of reliability of the sacraments was traditionally, I think, very important, precisely where introspection wasn't felt to give you the be-all and end-all. That's perhaps a different question. So we should be careful about saying that we know where God has and has not been guiding, one. And two, we should I think also should be careful about not saying that we know where our desires all tend. I don't think, maybe this is too revealing, but I don't think that there's an obvious sense in which everyone has a complete access to their own desires and their own tendencies. So I would say, thinking of Thomas like that, and I find this sort of sense that we get these infused but not necessarily visible virtues quite interesting in this way, that we can't quite know where everything comes from or where it tends. The Spirit bloweth where it listeth, sort of thing, and who can mark the passing of it.
To bring it back to the first conversation we had, it does, in reading Thomas, make it a bit of a challenge, I think, for a reader like myself to see where the philosophy and the theology cross. Now, obviously, all of it is of God, but there's a sense where we talk about faith, hope, and charity. So we're quoting St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and so on. And we understand the notion philosophically of teleology, and obviously you might say the creature is ordered towards the Creator. It's sent back in a certain sense, whatever that may be. Certainly not a beatific vision per se, but the idea that there's a longing for that, a desire for the thing that's created me, whatever I conceive that to be. But then also to look at these gifts of faith, hope, and love, and to say that obviously anything God gives, He doesn't take back. So you've got that fulfilling them in such a way that some of them even pass away. So there's no need for faith in the beatific vision because, there He is right in front of you, there's God.
Then we shall see face to face.
There's no need for hope because there's nothing more to hope for. And all of that is fulfilled in love, which in a way brings us back to God's very being and the way in which God loves, which is beyond our comprehension, and how Thomas is, unpacking, if you will, so much of that from different perspectives. I find it very fascinating when I read him, because as you say, he's not so easy to read.
Once you get the habit of that.
Reading, as opposed to reading Augustine,
Augustine's
different style.
Good reading, it's true.
So how would you then sort of synthesize this idea of desire being fulfilled in the beatific vision? That might be, again, a big ask.
What are the different things you'd be wanting me to hold together there?
I don't know myself. What I want to hold together is this notion that, as grace builds on nature and perfects it, that, as you mentioned before, grace then is not something extrinsic to ourselves. It's not an alien thing, but human nature itself, without grace, is not enough to get us to this beatific vision. So we may have a desire towards an end, but perhaps it's the end that's not completely known to us until we know God through the sacraments. I think that's true. So actually, one of the important parts of the picture, one of the important parts of the picture is sin, actually. Because while a lot of things are talked about in terms of nature and grace, this is a great contrast for Thomas. You've got nature, and then how and in what ways has grace built on that? Where can we detect grace as something additional? But the real question, I think, the desire is something more like a term about concrete life. This is Augustine's arena, concrete life. That's what he's so good at describing. That's why he's so readable. And that's what we actually have to work with. And there we're not really talking about nature and grace. We're talking about the struggle, the conflict, actually, of sin and grace.
And so I would say that in terms of, what we're being called beyond, concretely speaking, is generally not our nature. And so the worry about it in some ways is quite abstract of, whether it's natural or not. Really what we're being called beyond is the hash that we've made of it all, I suppose, in different, both personally and at large. And I will say, come back to that sort of the mess that's been made of things at the end of the next talk as well.
Oh, fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for synthesizing that.
Yeah.
We look forward to the fourth and final talk of this series.
Thank you.